I always thought my backyard pool was a sanctuary. It wasn't just a hole in the ground filled with water. It was the one place where I could shut off the noise of the world and sink into silence. After long days of work, I found peace in that shimmering rectangle of blue. But as it turned out, peace is fragile, especially when you live next door to people who don't understand boundaries. It started small, almost unnoticeable. One morning, I stepped out into the yard and saw wet footprints on the concrete leading away from the pool. At first, I thought maybe it was just the sprinklers, or perhaps an animal had wandered through. But then I saw the faint outline of a towel, one that didn't belong to me, stuffed carelessly behind a bush. My stomach tightened. Someone had been here. Someone had used my pool. The next day, the signs grew louder. The water level seemed slightly lower than usual, as if bodies had splashed it out during play. A faint smell of sunscreen lingered on the surface, a smell that had no business being there since I swam alone, without lotions or oils. That was when I started piecing it together. My neighbors. They were the type who treated the street like their kingdom, always loud, always nosy, never respecting privacy. Their kids often kicked balls over my fence, their music blared at odd hours, and their eyes lingered far too long on things that weren't theirs. Still, I tried to give them the benefit of the doubt. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was just being paranoid. But the evidence became undeniable one weekend when I came home earlier than usual. The sound hit me first, splashes, laughter, carefree voices echoing from my backyard. My chest tightened as I crept to the window. And there they were, 3 of them, floating in my pool as though it was theirs, sipping sodas and tossing a beach ball in the air. My sanctuary had been invaded, my private space turned into their playground. I stood frozen, torn between fury and disbelief. My first instinct was to storm outside and throw them all out. But something inside me held back. Maybe it was shock, maybe it was fear of confrontation, or maybe it was the cold, simmering anger that told me this wasn't the time. Instead, I watched them laugh and splash until they finally climbed out, leaving water dripping across the concrete, footprints leading straight back over the fence. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the scene. They didn't ask. They didn't apologize. They didn't even try to hide it. They had crossed into my space without permission, without care. My pool wasn't theirs, and yet they treated it as though they had earned the right to it. The longer I thought about it, the more that anger deepened into something darker, resolve. I realized I had 2 options. I could confront them directly, risk an ugly argument, and deal with the endless fallout of neighborly hostility. Or I could take another path, one that would let me reclaim control without uttering a single word. The second path felt right. Silent. Calculated. Effective. If they thought they could use my pool whenever they wanted, I would make sure the next time they did, it wouldn't be the experience they expected. I wouldn't scream, I wouldn't beg, I wouldn't fight. Instead, I would plan. Over the following week, I started observing them more closely. Their routines, their patterns, the times when my backyard seemed to tempt them the most. It became clear that weekends were their favorite window. Saturday afternoons, when the sun blazed high and the air demanded cool relief, my pool called to them like a siren. And they answered, slipping over the fence as though it was nothing more than a small step in a game. The thought twisted in my gut every time. I wanted to act right then, to fling open the back door and expose them. But I waited. I needed something better. Something that would not just stop them once, but would burn the memory of it into their minds so deeply they would never dare again. And so, my plan began to form. I started making small changes to the pool area, subtle things they wouldn't notice at first glance. I checked the filters, adjusted the lights, and laid groundwork for what was to come. Every time I walked past the water, I pictured their shocked faces when they realized the pool was no longer their playground but a trap of my own design. The anticipation was almost intoxicating. I felt like I was holding a secret, one they would stumble into blindly. My pool was no longer just a sanctuary. It was becoming a stage, and I was setting the scene for their humiliation. But as the week drew to a close and Saturday loomed closer, I couldn't shake a question from my mind. What if my plan went too far? What if I crossed a line just as they had crossed mine? A small part of me hesitated, whispering doubts in the dark. But then I would remember their laughter echoing in my yard, their careless splashing in my water, their footprints drying on my concrete. And the doubts melted away. This wasn't about pettiness. This was about respect. By Friday night, everything was in place. I stood by the pool under the glow of the porch light, staring into the still, perfect water. It looked normal, innocent, inviting, exactly as I wanted it to. But beneath that surface was the first step of my silent revenge, waiting patiently for them to make their move. The air was heavy with summer heat, thick and restless. I knew they wouldn't be able to resist. They never could. And so I waited. Saturday came, the sun rose, and with it came the sound I had been expecting, the faint scrape of the fence, the shuffle of feet landing on my grass. My heart pounded as I peered from the shadows, watching them approach my pool, laughing, carefree, oblivious to the trap I had set. They had no idea that this time, everything was different. The neighbors are about to jump into the pool, unaware of the clever plan waiting for them. They thought they were clever. They thought they could climb the fence, slip across my grass, and slide into my water without me ever knowing. But I was waiting. I had prepared every detail, right down to the last inch of the pool's edge. From my window, I watched them toss their towels onto my chair like they owned the place. Their voices carried on the hot air, careless and loud, the kind of laughter that cuts through silence like glass breaking. And then, with a running leap, one of them dove headfirst into the pool. The water erupted with a splash so loud it shook the air. For a moment, everything looked normal. They surfaced, slick with water, grinning as though this intrusion was a game. But then I saw it, the first flicker of confusion. A subtle change in their expression as they wiped their eyes and glanced around. Because the pool wasn't the same anymore. What they didn't realize was that earlier in the week, I had replaced the lighting system under the water. Now, instead of the soft glow they expected, I had wired the lights to flicker erratically, casting strange, jagged shadows across the walls. The calm blue had turned into something unsettling, a churning pool of shifting colors, like lightning trapped beneath the surface. Their laughter faltered as the second neighbor slipped in, followed by the third. The water danced with distorted light, flickering red, then green, then back to blue, a chaotic rhythm that made the pool look almost alive. It was disorienting, uncomfortable. They glanced at each other, uncertain, but still tried to play it off. After all, they had swum here before. But as they splashed around, the second part of my plan began to unfold. I had adjusted the water's temperature controls, lowering it to just above freezing the night before. To the skin, the first few seconds might feel refreshing, but as the minutes passed, that sharp cold would sink into their muscles, numbing their joy, stealing their comfort. I saw it happening from where I stood. Their playfulness turned sluggish. Their movements slowed, their smiles tightened, their chatter grew thinner. The shock of cold was working its way through them, and the once inviting pool had become a silent enemy. Still, they stayed in, perhaps too stubborn to admit something was wrong. And that's when I activated the final piece of the first phase. Hidden in the corner of the yard, just beyond their sight, I had installed a motion sensor connected to the outdoor speakers. As soon as the system detected their movement, the speakers came alive, not with music, not with noise, but with a low, rumbling sound I had carefully chosen. It was the deep, resonant growl of thunder mixed with the faint echo of whispers, layered and distorted until it no longer sounded like anything natural. It rolled across the yard like a storm trapped in the air, surrounding them, vibrating through the water itself. They froze, startled, exchanging uneasy glances. The sound wasn't deafening, but it was enough to crawl under their skin. Enough to remind them they weren't supposed to be here. From behind the glass, I felt a rush of satisfaction. It was working. My sanctuary was no longer a playground for them. It was a stage of fear, a reminder that they were intruders. And yet, a strange feeling crept over me as I watched. Power. Control. For the first time, I wasn't the victim. I wasn't the man who came home to footprints and stolen moments. I was the one pulling the strings, the one shaping the experience, turning their careless fun into unease. But as powerful as that felt, it was only the beginning. The neighbors lingered a little longer, trying to shake off their discomfort. But their laughter never returned, not fully. When they finally climbed out of the pool, their bodies shivered against the warm air, towels clutched tightly as they muttered nervously to one another. They left quickly, glancing around as though someone might be watching. And I was. That night, I sat in the dark, staring at the still water, and replayed the scene in my head. The plan had worked, but only partly. They were unsettled, yes, but not deterred. I could see it in their hesitation, in the way they glanced back at the pool as they slipped over the fence. They would return. And so, I decided the next phase would have to be bolder. I began researching ways to heighten their unease without stepping outside the bounds of legality. I didn't want the police involved. I wanted this to stay between us, a private war over a piece of ground they thought they could claim. I wanted to create something unforgettable, something that would turn my pool into the last place they'd dare trespass again. The thought consumed me over the following days. At work, at night, even in my dreams, I was building scenarios, imagining the looks on their faces when I escalated the game. The fear would grow, the tension would tighten, and eventually, they'd break. By Friday evening, my next set of preparations was complete. I tested the new elements under the cover of dusk, the yard cloaked in shadows. Each step felt like tightening a noose, not around their necks, but around their arrogance, their entitlement. I knew they would come back. Their type always does. Curiosity mixed with boldness, the thrill of getting away with something forbidden. It was too strong for them to resist. And when they did return, the trap would be waiting. Saturday came again, hot and oppressive, the kind of heat that drives people to water like moths to flame. I went about my day calmly, almost casually, as though I didn't know what was about to happen. But inside I was restless, a coil of anticipation winding tighter with every passing hour. Then, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched long, I heard it, the faint, familiar scrape of the fence. The shuffle of feet. The whispered giggles carried on the warm breeze. They were back. And this time, they wouldn't leave with just a chill and a strange sound in their ears. This time, they would experience the second act of my plan, the part that would shift their unease into something deeper. Something closer to fear. The neighbors have returned, unaware that the next phase of the narrator's plan is about to begin. They came back with the same swagger, the same careless grin that said, "We can do this again." I watched them cross my lawn like trespassers who had never been taught respect, their shadows long and lazy as the evening sun sank low. This time, I didn't wait behind glass. I moved through the house like a conductor taking his position, every instrument tuned and ready for the moment I would lift my baton. What I had planned for the second act was psychological, subtle, and personal. Cold, flickering lights and ominous noises had rattled them, but in their world discomfort could be shrugged off. People complain, then forget. I needed something that lodged into memory, that pried on nerves and left a lasting impression. I wanted them to feel watched, to sense that my pool had a presence they could not control or predict. Something that would make their bravado look foolish in front of the people who mattered to them. So I turned the pool into a mirror. Not a simple reflection, but a manipulated surface that would show them versions of themselves they wouldn't expect to see. I spent the afternoon installing a thin, near-invisible film across half the pool, anchored under the waterline and stretched taut like a secret membrane. From above, it barely disturbed the glassy surface. From below, however, it could be transformed into an uncanny screen. I had also acquired a small, weatherproof projection unit, nothing fancy, just a device that could throw images in low light. I hid it beneath the decking, angling it carefully so that when the sun softened and the lights I'd installed took effect, the film would become the stage for whatever I chose to project. I thought about projecting faces, or shadows, or images that hinted at something supernatural. In the end, I picked something crueler and quieter. I chose to project their own faces, distorted and exaggerated, layered with faint echoes of their laughter, only this time slowed and warped so that it sounded foreign, like a recording played through a long tunnel. Setting it up took time and patience. I tested angles, hit small snags, adjusted the film until it swallowed the projected light in the right way. The trick was to make the images look as though they rose from the water itself, not cast from a machine. I wanted them to feel the uncanny sensation of seeing themselves looking back in a way they had never looked before, older, smaller, ridiculous. Humiliation is a powerful teacher. When the sun finally dipped and the bulbs in the yard hummed to life, I ran a quiet check from the window. The pool lay there, deceptively calm, the film invisible to any casual glance. I could have gone further with theatrics, fog machines, colored lights, a chorus of recorded whispers, but restraint was part of my code. I wanted the effect to be intimate, not theatrical, a private humiliation that would sting more because it felt so personal. They approached, two at first, then the third trailing with an overconfident swagger that I recognized as a mask for nerves. Towels slung over shoulders, they dropped them like trophies and slid into the water. The surface accepted them like it always had, unknowing, obedient. For a breathless moment they laughed, the sound brief and brittle in the cooling air. Then I flicked the switch. At first it was subtle, a ripple of light that moved under the surface. They glanced around, searching for the source, the way people do when something small jars the world's expected alignment. I held my breath. The projection bloomed slowly, like a tide revealing something long hidden. On the film, their faces emerged. Only these faces were no longer the jaunty, careless grins they wore in life. The projection stretched and pulled features, smudged the corners of their mouths, elongated laughter into a tight snarl. The effect was minor enough that a passerby might have called it a trick of light, yet sharp enough to wrench discomfort out of them. They saw themselves not as they wanted to be seen, but as versions of themselves trapped and ridiculous on the water's surface. Their reaction was immediate and raw. One of them froze mid-stroke, eyes narrowed until the whites glowed in the half-light. The other two laughed at first, nervous energy disguised as bravado, but the laughter thinned and cracked. They looked at each other, then back at the pool, as if seeking confirmation that they were not imagining it. That's when the sound came in, the slow, warped playback of their own chuckles, dragged into a crawl and overlaid with a faint metallic echo. Hearing their own mirth turned into something monstrous undid them faster than any warning could have. I watched the way their shoulders curled inward, how their movements became guarded. Pride is a fragile creature. Put it in front of a mirror that distorts, and it crumbles. They tried to play it off, splashing, making jokes, but the surface kept changing, flashes of their childhood faces, quick cuts of them drenched and angry, a ghostly montage that seemed to follow every twitch of their limbs. It felt as if the pool were reading them, remembering moments they hid from the world and refusing to let them stay private. I felt a satisfaction so sharp it surprised me. My plan was not merely a trick, it had the elegance of a sentence that landed exactly where it needed to. They were no longer in control. Where they had once laughed and declared dominion over my lawn, they now searched for the exit. One of them clambered out, teeth clenched tight, towel pressed to skin as if to smother the chill that had little to do with temperature. The others hovered, uncertain, eyes darting toward the fence, toward the houses across the street, toward any refuge. Even in the dim light, I could see the math of humiliation doing its work. Pride weighed against the fear of being seen embarrassed by friends and family. That, more than anything, would make them think twice. Humiliation spreads not as quickly as pain, but its memory digs deeper. I wanted them to carry this with them into the world where other people lived, into barbecues, into social media posts, into family gatherings, so that using my pool would no longer be just an act of convenience but a gamble with reputation. And yet, even as I watched my plan unfold perfectly, a different emotion rose like a second current, guilt, faint and unwelcome. There was a line between retribution and cruelty that I had straddled then leaned into. I had told myself I would be precise, just enough to teach respect. Now, looking at them shivering and embarrassed, I wondered if I had gone too far. Revenge is a slippery slope. One misstep and you tumble into something that no longer resembles justice. I barely had time to ponder it before something else happened, something I had not entirely planned for. As one neighbor lunged for the ladder and hauled himself out, his phone slipped from the towel on the deck and skidded toward the water. It teetered on the edge, a shiny rectangle that caught the projection, then slid and disappeared with a soft, final plop. The moment stretched and broke. The three of them froze as if pulled by the same thread. The pool that had been their stage now held something wholly irreversible, their private images captured in the glow of a phone screen, lost beneath the surface, unreachable. Their faces tightened into expressions I had not aimed to create: panic, uncertainty, the sudden calculation of consequences beyond humiliation. My heart knocked against my ribs. The plan had been to teach a lesson, not to escalate into potential accident. A phone in water was nothing compared to harm to a person, but it had the power to transform the humiliation into something else: anger, vindictiveness, perhaps a confrontation that would drag the whole neighborhood into a mess I had tried so carefully to avoid. I watched them scramble, towels forgotten, hands flailing as they tried to reach the phone. The projection pulsed one last time, the distorted faces wavering, then fading into a low blue that reflected the real faces now hovering over the water. Faces that no longer looked like children playing, but like trespassers on the brink of a new kind of danger. And across the street, the lights in a house I had never noticed before flicked on. A silhouette leaned at the window, watching. Something in me tightened like a spring that had been wound too far. The night that had begun as a precise act of retaliation now felt precarious and exposed. The moment held, taut and trembling, as they reached into the water, and then, with a collective inhale that I could feel even from the distance, a hand plunged toward the pool. A phone has fallen into the pool while the narrator's projection is active. Neighbors reach into the water, risking escalation, and someone across the street is watching. The hand plunged into the water, breaking the surface with a sound that felt sharper than it should have been. Ripples stretched across the pool, distorting the faint blue projection until their own warped faces seemed to scream silently back at them. For a split second, I thought the hand would close around the phone and everything would end there, tidy, almost anticlimactic. But the water swallowed deeper than expected, and the phone slipped out of reach. The neighbor pulled his arm back, shaking off the cold with a growl of frustration, though no words reached me. The two others hovered anxiously, eyes darting between the dark water, the glowing film, and the house across the street where that silhouette still lingered in the window. My chest tightened. I hadn't counted on an audience. This was supposed to be private, a closed circle of lesson and consequence. Now, it felt like the curtain had been pulled back on something larger, something I wasn't prepared to explain. The phone sank further, its screen still faintly glowing as it drifted down like a drowned star. Their panic intensified, and I could see it in their movements, jerky, uncontrolled, desperate. Pride was gone. Fear had taken its place. They weren't worried about the distorted faces anymore. They were worried about what would be found on that phone if someone else recovered it before they did. A device like that wasn't just an object. It was a vault of messages, photos, secrets. Things no one wanted exposed. One of them dove under, his body slicing through the projection film as if breaching a fragile skin. The image shattered, faces smearing into streaks of light before dissolving entirely. For the first time, my creation failed me. The pool was no longer a mirror. It was just water, dark and deep, holding something more dangerous than fear, evidence. Seconds ticked by too long, long enough that unease clawed at me. Then he burst back to the surface, gasping, shaking his head. No phone. His friends snapped into action, diving in one after another, creating chaos in the water, arms thrashing, bubbles rising, their panic echoing in the hollow sound of splashes. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt something colder, a flicker of dread. This was no longer a controlled performance. The pool had become a stage for desperation, and desperation was unpredictable. People can drown in moments like these, not just in water but in the quicksand of fear and shame. And if something happened here, if one of them didn't resurface, the story would no longer be about trespassing. It would be about me, the man whose backyard had become a grave. The thought coiled through me, heavy and suffocating. I moved closer to the window, fingers pressing against the glass, torn between stepping outside to put an end to it and staying hidden to preserve my secret. My breath fogged the pain as I wrestled with the weight of that choice. Each splash felt louder, each gasp sharper, each second stretching longer than it should. Then, suddenly, silence. They surfaced together, faces pale, eyes wide, their hands empty. The phone was gone, swallowed by the pool's depths. They dragged themselves out of the water, shivering and dripping, their arrogance stripped away entirely. Towels clung to them like armor, but their postures betrayed them, shoulders slumped, heads low, movements frantic. They didn't laugh this time. They didn't linger. They stumbled back toward the fence, climbing with trembling hands, their voices low and sharp, like whispers carved out of panic. One slipped, nearly falling, before clawing his way over. Then they were gone, leaving the yard heavy with silence, the pool still and unassuming once again, as though nothing had happened. But something had. I stayed frozen for minutes after, staring at the calm water where the phone now rested like an anchor. I could almost see it down there in my mind, glowing faintly, holding all of their secrets, waiting like evidence that could resurface at any moment. That pool was no longer just water to me. It was a vault, a weapon, a witness. And then there was the matter of the silhouette. Across the street, the light in the window remained. The figure hadn't moved much, but I felt the weight of its gaze pressing against me, unblinking, patient. I didn't know who it was or how much they had seen, but I knew this. My secret war with the neighbors was no longer mine alone. Someone else had been invited into the story, and I hadn't given them permission. That night I barely slept. My mind spun in tight circles, about the phone, the neighbors, the watcher across the street. I imagined conversations I couldn't control, stories whispered over fences, rumors leaking through the neighborhood like cracks in a wall. The plan had been simple once: unsettle them, reclaim control, restore respect. But the pool had become something else now. A stage, yes, but also a trap, and not just for them. For me too. By morning, the silence of the house pressed down on me. I moved through rooms like a ghost, every window a potential eye staring in. My sanctuary no longer felt like mine. I couldn't even look at the pool without feeling my pulse quicken, imagining the phone down there glowing like a warning light. That was when I realized I couldn't just wait. I had to act. I had to retrieve the phone before they tried again. If they returned and succeeded, they'd hold the narrative, twisting it however they pleased. They could claim I had tampered with the pool, that I had engineered their humiliation. They could turn neighbors into allies against me. And the silhouette across the street, who knew what story they would tell if given the chance? No, I had to get to the phone first. To claim it. To erase whatever danger it held. That evening, under the cover of dusk, I stood at the edge of the pool with a skimmer pole in hand. The water was dark, colder than usual, reflecting only fragments of the fading sky. I told myself it was simple, just another object to retrieve, no different than a toy or a fallen branch. But as I looked down, I felt something else staring back at me from beneath the surface. The pool had changed. It was no longer just water. It was a keeper of secrets, and I had given it power. I lowered the pole slowly, the net cutting through the water with a faint hiss. Inch by inch, I guided it deeper, sweeping blindly, searching for the faint, solid weight of a phone. My heart hammered louder with each drag. Any second I expected to hit it, to feel it scrape into the net, to pull it up and end this nightmare. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. I froze, lifting my head. Across the street, the silhouette was gone. And behind me, near the fence, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on grass. As the narrator attempts to retrieve the phone, the watcher disappears from across the street, and someone, or something, enters the backyard. The sound of footsteps on the grass tightened every muscle in my body. For a split second, I thought it was them again, the neighbors, creeping back to reclaim what they'd lost. My grip on the skimmer pole tightened, heart pounding against my ribs like it wanted out. Slowly I turned, expecting to see their familiar shapes climbing over the fence. But it wasn't them. It was the silhouette. The very figure I had seen night after night in the window across the street. And now, they were standing inside my yard. The figure moved with purpose, not stealth. Their steps were deliberate, not rushed, each one a statement that they weren't sneaking. They were entering with the confidence of someone who believed they had a right to be here. In the dim glow of the pool lights, I finally saw their face, an older man, weathered features framed by silver hair, eyes sharp as glass. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. He looked curious. I froze, caught between fear and indignation. I hadn't invited him here. This was my property, my sanctuary, my stage of secrets. Yet here he was, standing on my grass like a judge arriving late to a trial. For a long, unbearable moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the pool filter, steady and indifferent, as if mocking the storm brewing above it. My mind spun with questions. Had he seen everything? Did he know about the lights, the sounds, the mirror projection? Did he know about the phone? The man's eyes shifted from me to the pool, lingering on the surface as though he could see through the water to the object hidden below. A knot formed in my throat. He knew. Somehow he knew. He took another step forward, then another, until he stood at the edge of the concrete. His shoes made no sound, his presence no apology. I felt smaller under his gaze, as though the authority I had built through careful control and clever traps had been stripped away in seconds. He was watching not as a neighbor, but as something else, something higher, something colder. I wanted to speak, to demand why he was here, to reclaim the authority of my own backyard. But my throat locked. The words refused to rise. Instead, I simply stared, skimmer pole trembling faintly in my grip, like a weapon I wasn't sure I could use. Then, slowly, he crouched at the pool's edge. His reflection stretched across the surface, fractured by the faint ripples of water. He leaned forward, peering down as if the pool were a window into something deeper. My chest tightened. Any second, I expected him to reach in, to pull the phone from the depths, to hold it up like evidence in a trial. But he didn't. Instead, he stood, straightened his back, and turned his gaze directly on me. His eyes caught the light, cold and unwavering. And though his lips never moved, I felt the weight of unspoken words pressing against me. I know what you've done. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and walked away. Not toward the fence, but toward the gate at the side of the yard. The gate I had locked. I blinked stunned. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen him use it. Yet the latch clicked softly behind him as he slipped through, disappearing into the shadows of the street. I was alone again. But the solitude no longer comforted me. It pressed against me, suffocating, filled with questions I couldn't answer. Who was he? Why had he been watching? And why, of all moments, had he chosen tonight to step into my yard? I looked back at the pool. The water lay still, but beneath that stillness, the phone remained. It hadn't moved, hadn't disappeared. It was waiting. Waiting for someone to claim it. I knew then that the neighbors would return. They couldn't afford to leave their secrets behind. And now, with the watcher involved, the stakes had changed. It wasn't just about trespassing anymore. It was about exposure. That night, I barely left the window. I sat in the dark, staring at the pool, waiting for the sound of the fence, the scrape of shoes, the return of the ones who had started this spiral. Every noise outside set my nerves on edge, the rustle of leaves, the hum of a passing car, the distant bark of a dog. I was wound so tight that even my own heartbeat sounded like a threat. And then, just after midnight, the sound came. The fence rattled. Voices hushed and urgent, like conspirators gathering in the dark. The neighbors were back, just as I knew they would be. And this time, their mission was clear, the phone. I leaned forward, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the water. The pool glistened under the pale moonlight, innocent, deceptive. They approached quickly, without towels, without laughter. Their movements were sharp, desperate. They weren't here to play. One of them pointed toward the deep end, voice low but trembling with urgency. Another stripped off his shirt and slipped into the water, vanishing beneath the surface with barely a ripple. The others hovered at the edge, glancing around nervously, their fear palpable. I gripped the window frame so tightly my knuckles ached. This was it. The moment everything hinged on. If they found the phone, my control vanished. If they failed, the pool would claim another secret, and the cycle would continue. But as the diver resurfaced, gasping, his hands empty, something else happened. Something I hadn't planned, hadn't expected. The pool lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. But the water wasn't the same. A glow pulsed beneath the surface, faint at first, then stronger, brighter, until the entire pool seemed to throb with light. The neighbors froze, staring down into it, their fear turning into something deeper, horror. Because in that glow, shapes were forming. Not projections. Not tricks. Faces. And this time, they weren't distorted versions of themselves. They were strangers. The neighbors dived for the phone but instead see glowing, unfamiliar faces forming in the pool. The light beneath the surface grew stronger, flooding the water with an eerie, unearthly glow. The neighbors stumbled back from the edge, their faces pale in the shifting illumination. The ones still in the pool clawed for the ladder, scrambling out as though the water itself had turned hostile. I pressed my forehead against the window glass, unable to look away, unable to breathe. The faces grew clearer. Men and women, young and old, none of them familiar. Their eyes wide, mouths open as if caught in a scream. They floated just below the surface, their features twisting and warping with each ripple of the water, staring up with silent desperation. I told myself it was an illusion, a trick of light, some leftover glitch of my own devices. But deep down I knew. This wasn't mine. This wasn't something I had created. The pool had never been mine to control. It had been something else all along. The neighbors huddled together, whispering, their panic sharp and frantic. One of them pointed at the deep end again, where the phone still lay, the glow illuminating its outline like a beacon. Their greed hadn't disappeared. It had grown teeth. Even in the presence of horror, they wanted what was theirs. Two of them climbed back into the water. The glow wrapped around their bodies as they swam down, hands outstretched toward the phone. I leaned forward, every nerve in my body screaming for them to stop. When their fingers brushed the object, the glow flared white-hot. The pool roared, not with sound, but with energy. A wave surged upward, drenching the concrete, rattling the fence, spraying even against my window. I gasped as the neighbors vanished beneath the surface, swallowed whole in an instant. The others screamed. They ran to the edge, peering down, calling out. But nothing came back. No splash, no struggle. The surface lay flat and still again, glowing faintly, as though nothing had disturbed it at all. The phone was gone. Gone with them. The ones who remained bolted, stumbling over each other as they fled into the night, disappearing into the shadows of the street. Their cries faded, leaving me alone again with the silence, with the pool. But I was not alone. The watcher returned. His figure appeared at the far corner of the yard, half shrouded in darkness, eyes fixed on the glowing water. He didn't step closer, didn't enter again. He only stood, as though satisfied, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. And then, slowly, deliberately, he turned and walked away into the night, never once looking back. I was shaking, my breath shallow, my hands cold. My clever tricks, my desperate games, they had all been meaningless. The pool had played me as much as it had played them. It wasn't my trap. It was something older, deeper, darker. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the water. The glow had faded, but its memory clung to me like damp clothes, heavy and suffocating. I thought of the faces beneath, strangers I'd never met, people who had no reason to be there. Were they victims? Witnesses? Or simply reflections of what the pool wanted me to see? As the hours dragged toward dawn, one truth hardened in my chest. The pool didn't belong to me. It never had. It belonged to itself. And anyone who dared to take from it, whether laughter, trespass, or secrets, would pay its price. When the sun finally rose, the water sparkled as if nothing had happened. Blue, clean, inviting. A picture of peace. But I knew better. I knew what waited beneath, patient and hungry. And though I promised myself I'd never go near it again, never step foot on that concrete, never touch that water, I couldn't look away. Because deep inside, I knew the pool wasn't finished. And neither was I.